Yeah, this is not a bad April Fool's joke. It's actually me. So, Secret Lives of Systems. Really kind of a favorite topic of mine, but favorite is probably not the right word to kind of put on it, because I'd rather not be thinking about this. I'd rather it sort of not be an issue that we deal with. But it's here, and it's something we have to grapple with. I've been privileged to take part in this conversation with three really amazing technologists, writers, artists, and when Jose Luis asked if I would do this, I jumped at the chance to actually be part of this conversation. Nothing characterizes the new normal and sort of sets up this theme of unknown futures at this moment like this kind of debate, this sort of discussion. The reaction, I would say actually in some cases mostly deafening to the sort of dark euphemisms that we've referred to not only in public in our own kind of work and lives, but over the past few days you've sort of heard it echo through the conversations. The Snowden revelations, always kind of in air quotes or scare quotes. In polite conversation or security cleared company, we just say recent events. But we don't really kind of lock down and confront the types of issues, and particularly the kind of questions that we need to be asking, and not just having a kind of idle debate, and not even just having a small group of people spin their wheels, but really engaging as a public, as citizens, with these secret lives of systems that begin to kind of envelop us. Anab set us down this path yesterday with her excellent keynote, talking about the architectures of control, which I thought was an often elegant phrase to kind of describe this. They are systems that begin to surround us. It's built into our infrastructure. It's on us. It's in some cases in us. And we have to really think, and not just think, but do, if we want to kind of retain our path. Really the whole festival has pointed in different ways to these ideas of complexity, to secrecy, to legibility. I think, as someone pointed out earlier, has been a key theme of this event. Jose Luis asked me if I would not just kind of do this as a heavy conversation, but kind of try to recreate the ebb and flow of the sort of ongoing asynchronous debates that happen amongst us and also many of you on platforms like Twitter and other kind of media where we carry these discussions on in real time throughout the day. I asked him kind of which part he wanted, pre or post watershed. He didn't specify, so I'll leave it to the speakers. If you have questions, you can tweet me at Changist, and I will try to collate those, and we'll have them at the end. We have three speakers here that are absolutely fantastic, and James Bridle, and Eleanor Saida, and finally Adam Harvey. First up is going to be James. In many cases doesn't need an introduction. None of these artists need introductions, but just to give you a sense of the kind of work that he's done. James wrote this I think incredibly influential article last year about the Ring of Steel for Matter magazine that you may know. But beyond that, his work with visualizing the sort of shape of drones in our own lives, his work with Dronestagram, his other writing, his work with Render Ghosts, the kind of list goes on and on. He's had an amazing couple of years, and he also kind of illuminated this concept of the new aesthetic for us as well. And I think that all of these kind of topics together makes James a sort of great voice to start us off with. He's, of course, working in New York, I guess, for the next few months in a residency there, and writing for a number of publications, but I will give you James Bridle to start off with. James.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure what the gaffer tape's for, so I might just put that down. Thank you, Scott, for that introduction. Thank you, FutureEverything, for having me back. Thank you all for being here. I spoke at FutureEverything 2 years ago, and I talked about data centers and robot camel jockeys and a number of other things, which, although of course I didn't realize at the time, kind of set me off down a whole bunch of kind of different paths of research that I've followed up in the time since, and has led to kind of a lot of the thinking that I've done in that time, which is always good, and I hope it's at least what my talks do for me, and I hope this will do for other people as well. And since then, I've been doing a lot of this sort of work. This is one of my drone shadow projects that Scott alluded to, painting out the outline of a drone in public space. This one's actually in Washington, D.C. last summer, right next to the White House, bizarrely. Secret Service agents watched us do it, which was fun. And what this project is in part about is about sketching out invisible systems. It's about looking at the things that technology renders invisible to us and making them visible again, to kind of close that lap, to allow perhaps for some kind of activity and action. But at the same time, I'm personally kind of increasingly frustrated with this is a bare approach. It was kind of a side effect of the research I was doing. I'm really pleased with it, and it has done that thing of opening up a space of debate. But I think for myself, and possibly for quite a lot of us, the idea of just opening a space for debate isn't really enough. We're building so many of the tools that shape the world around us, and then kind of handing them off to other people to do things with them that perhaps we wouldn't be so keen for them to be doing. So I'm also increasingly suspicious of certain dialogues within this discourse about the future, because I don't really believe the future exists. In the most cliched form, the future is what we make of it. That's the kind of standard cliche, but it's also what a lot of other stuff and things and people and history make it of us as well. We live in this kind of junkyard of past futures, which still continue to kind of shape and inform the present as well. We'd have to see those things as all part of a kind of ongoing timeline. And what I'm increasingly interested in is not just this kind of open-ended, let us create a speculation, let us create a space for debate, but in how is it possible for us to act kind of more directly in the present? I want to know if it's possible to achieve kind of real directed change in a networked world in the way in which, as technologists, we've kind of been training ourselves to achieve computational changes within kind of smaller systems. And not just by enticing kind of small behavioral changes, but by intervening in the processes themselves. Because the world kind of, like, or indeed because of technology, is not static. It's not neutral. It's constantly being kind of produced by the systems that surround us all the time, like the architecture that surrounds us. This is one of my favorite ways of talking about the way systems shape the world. If you go out into Manchester, the city around us, if you go and look at all those hoardings with the kind of glossy visions of buildings on them, these CGI renderings of what these buildings will be like, and then see their kind of uncanny doubles rising up behind them, which are uncanny because they resemble their kind of screen-based counterparts, but they're kind of secondary to them. They're produced not by architects, most of them not by trained architects at all, kind of attentive to the real world use cases or affordances of these buildings, but by developers and planners, space-filling algorithms, the sort of default drop-down menus in software programs, and the legal frameworks that define what buildings can be built, what restrictions there are on those things. And these frameworks produce the world, and they also produce knowledge and our understanding of it. This was a project of mine from a few years back, which I still keep coming back to because I keep, for myself, kind of learning new things from it, which is called the Wikipedia Historiography Project, which is a set of 12 books that reproduce a single Wikipedia article. But they don't reproduce the article itself, they reproduce the changelog of that article, the history of that article, every single edit that was made to that article. And it turns out when you print all of those out, a single article takes the size and shape and form of an old-school encyclopedia, of kind of all the knowledge we see fit to print, embedded in the creation of a single one. What I love about Wikipedia's history function is it makes visible the process by which we're constructing that knowledge in the kind of limited domain of Wikipedia. And there's clear choices that have gone into designing a software that produces that as an outcome, that makes that available to us. It's part of the philosophy of the system. So how can we start to approach a true understanding of the world which is constantly produced by complex, invisible, and networked systems? When just kind of sketching these things out is really just a starting point, and potentially a reduction in all possible understandings of the subject. really just the shadows that these systems cast into the world, and fairly static ones at that. They don't describe the full system, and they're certainly kind of incapable of interacting with it in turn and shaping it in return. In order to understand some of these technological, invisible, and only occasionally legible systems, I've been looking increasingly at other invisible, occasionally legible systems, like the law. I stumbled on this approach while I was researching something that Scott mentioned in the introduction, a whole pile of research into automatic number plate recognition, which is kind of a really boring form of surveillance. But I was really interested in it because we're starting to hear, in the middle of last year, the explosion of hearing about all of these forms of kind of pervasive blanket surveillance that just hoover up kind of all possible available data and munge it through kind of interpretive analytic systems. But like all these other things, it was hard to point at, right? That's why the Snowden revelations had that weight, because they came with all these documents attached. But we still have very little idea of what these systems look like beyond the kind of idle smiley doodles of NSA engineers. What can we point to when we want to talk about complex, pervasive surveillance systems? And I realized it was kind of the cameras at the end of my street. If you don't know too much about ANPR, automatic number plate recognition, it's quite a big deal in this country, not least because we invented it. The sort of really British boffin in the shed kind of stereotype is, true of surveillance as it's true for a few other technologies. The ANPR system as it operates in this country is a vast blanket intelligence gathering system that monitors pretty much every single, medium to large town centre and medium to major road in the country. If you've driven through any of those any time in the last 5 years, your journey is recorded by a series of cameras. These cameras include ones operated directly by the police. It includes also petrol station forecourts and kind of council parking cameras and this kind of thing, a whole load of cameras. And we don't have a complete map of these cameras, not least because the police don't want to give us one. But there are a fuck ton of them. It's an incredibly large intelligence-gathering network that sort of isn't really kind of discussed. And the thing about this system is that it stores all of this data. Okay, this is the thing that I find sort of interesting, extraordinary about this. By the way, is not the current police computer. Though there is a current police computer. It's called the National Police Computer, and it's at the National ANPR Centre in Hendon in North London. This was the one that was installed in Tintagel House in London. It was one of the first ones. It was mostly used for calculating police pay, but I like it. I'm interested in it particularly because it was actually firebombed by the Angry Brigade in May of 1971, and I'm particularly interested in kind of like physical actions against digital infrastructures, as possibly was attempted against the town hall here yesterday. But also because it's important to always note how many of these kind of civic functions now occur within objects like this. The reason we can have a conference in this town hall today is because most of the civic functions of it happen in data centers kind of far away. So the police take all this ANPR data, this vast numbers of records of license plates and their locations at given times and cross-referenceable and so on and so forth, and they store all this data in this database for what they claim to be 5 years. And I say that they claim in that way, not because I don't believe them, because actually they do tend to stick to their own processes in many ways, whatever you may think of those processes, but because they don't have to do that. They claim to treat this data as personal data, but they don't have to, which is a surprise because we've spent the last 10 years developing quite extensive laws that are supposed to cover this kind of thing. We have laws, the two primary ones being the Data Protection Act, from 1998, and this one, the Regulation Investigatory Powers Act from 2000, one of which to cover kind of corporate uses of data, the other one of state and intelligence service use of data. And they define a series of things which they call personal data, identifiable data, which are covered by particular laws. So while I was researching this vast network of cameras that are watching us all the time, I thought, well, hang on a sec, this seems like the sort of thing that those sort of laws are supposed to cover. So I went and read these, bits of legislation. I actually went and looked at them. And it turns out, in fact, that if you close read them, vehicle data, license plates, are explicitly exempt from the data protection laws, which is counterintuitive, as license plates are, by and large, identifiable to a vehicle owner or someone who's hired that vehicle through credit card records or through their employer, or so on and so forth. But into both of these laws is written a very explicit exemption that vehicle data is not personal data, which allows for blanket collection of all journey details around the UK. And that's something that's been explicitly and deliberately written into those laws by people who want to do this. And I realized that it's sort of possible to do a kind of brass rubbing on the law itself, to kind of reveal these lacunae, that reveal the intention of the people who framed them, and possibly to reveal things that they might be doing with them that we're not yet aware of. Both to reveal the intentions of those actors who do it, and possibly to intervene and work out how we shape the things that we wedge into those gaps. This is one of my favorite projects of all time. It's another architectural project. It's from a book called Subplan by Finn Williams and David Knight. And in it, these guys, they're planners and architects, they perform a close reading on UK planning law, on another really fundamentally boring bit of law that you kind of start to realize shapes the world around us in deeply fundamental ways. And what they do is they focus on what's called permitted development, i.e. what you can do without having planning permission. And then they use this information to explore a range of options for things you can get away with. So speculative designs for buildings that fulfill the kind of necessary functions that you might want to do to your house or whatever, that don't require this kind of permission. For example, in this one, someone with a lot of stuff doesn't want to go through the business of getting an extension. Turns out, under certain circumstances, chimneys are exempt from extension, from these kind of planning laws. As a result, why not just build loads of chimneys on your house and use them for storage? As a quick side note, I think that idea that the permission we already have is actually an incredibly important concept and one kind of worth highlighting for a second. Not least, and I usually don't talk about this, but I get asked about it all the time, which is don't you get into trouble for the things that you do? Meaning things like looking for, secret drone bases in the Iraqi desert using Google Maps. And the answer is, A, I'm like a posh, privileged British white man, and I'm about as safe as it gets around here. But also, more crucially, you don't need permission to do this stuff. As soon as you start shading into these kinds of areas, people start to have these kind of worries. But this stuff is the stuff and substance of civic life. It's what you vote, you pay taxes for, you work for it. And while I can't sort of compel anyone to go out and look for this stuff ourselves, most of us in this room are lucky enough to possess the permission to do this already. And that, occasionally we should be pushing the boundaries of choosing to exercise that. Subplan, the book, starts in that kind of domestic sphere and scales it up a little, just enough to kind of get you interested into the potential architectures at a kind of city scale of what this kind of analysis might make possible in terms of kind of urban planning and the city. And it does that by not examining the aesthetics or materials of the built environment, but by the framework of the law itself. It kind of concretizes the intention of that law. And what it's doing is essentially translating that potentially back into another domain. It's doing what software engineers would call fuzz testing, which is basically where you throw a load of junk random data at a system and see what breaks. By doing so, you don't try to anticipate the failure states of your system. You just completely and totally fill the probability space in order to see what leaks out. I've been talking a lot to some brilliant people as a result of my drone work called the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots, who have a brilliant name, but they're very serious people. They're a huge coalition of NGOs, mostly with a particular interest in human rights and weapons, and the use of weapons. And I said they're serious people because they spent the last 10 years campaigning to get new legislation passed against cluster munitions and landmines. And we've all heard a lot, I think, in the news over the last decade about the efforts to get cluster munitions and landmines banned. This same group of NGOs kind of did this. And now they're looking at another target, which is autonomous weapons. So drones are, basically, in the most part, remote-controlled planes. And they're not vastly different from other forms of contemporary weaponry that might be manned, really, in many ways. The next generation of autonomous weapons, which is weapons that may make the decision themselves when to fire, that don't require a human pulling the trigger, that perform their own analysis and decide who gets killed, that starts to look like a bigger issue. And so the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots are working with the same bodies they did before, the UN and the Red Cross and people like this, to try and maybe get some preemptive legislation in place about this. But that's even harder this time round because there's nothing to point at, right? With landmines and cluster munitions, there's a fairly horrifying bank of imagery you can show people to show the effects of this stuff. But here, with this stuff, we're back to that same problem of invisible networks, invisible systems, and how you draw them. And it keeps, the invisible thing becomes a trope, and you keep saying invisible, invisible over again. These things are not invisible. They are largely intangible, which means we need other ways of describing them, but they frequently appear in certain ways around them if we have the literacy to read them. There's an interesting thing that happens when new weapons come out. There are, a huge range of existing international law on the use of weapons. One of them is something called Article 36 of the Geneva Convention, which was a later addendum. There've been a whole series. It was actually added to the Geneva Conventions in 1977. There was a further addition, various kind of things in 1980 and throughout the 80s, as they tried to make this law work better. Because the law says that new forms of weapons must be evaluated against, what level of indiscriminate effects they produce. Are they proportional? What's the risk to civilians? This is an international law against which things should be measured. And so every time a new campaign, like the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots, comes along and goes, there's this new weapon, you should think about it, governmental lawyers all around the world go, don't worry, we have Article 36 for this. Now, pretty much everyone in the international community is already fairly sure that Article 36 can't handle this at all. So how do we start pushing against this law? How do we perform the same close reading on it in order to find out what its potential weaknesses are for as yet unseen systems? Because we know that those illegible frameworks are too easily manipulated by power, but also technology loves generating these kind of frameworks around them and has developed a whole raft of approaches and tests for them. So would it be possible for us to brute force a new convention on autonomous weapons by essentially fuzz testing Article 36, by throwing so many new options and essentially a critical, technologically literate eye on the statute, that we might just throw out some argument solutions that are not yet within our grasp? And oops, sorry, I just justified the existence of the 3D printed gun, which is a side effect of that process. My point is we have the tools to address these issues because we've been learning to use them and building them for years. Recently I've been involved, almost by accident, in activism around asylum and deportation in the UK, a process which transforms some of the poorest and most vulnerable people into the world essentially into such fuzz testing objects, which they're thrown into this kind of the hasty confusions of UK asylum law to test its edges, which, believe me, are incredibly fuzzy, and the whims of our contemporary politicians. I've been showing immigrant rights groups how to use, for example, Flight Radar 24, a website that tracks all air traffic around the world that uses a beacon, which is most of it, in order to identify private charter planes that are being used to deport asylum seekers under slightly deeply worrying conditions. I did this by accident because I knew how to use this tool and it was available to me, and because this is the approach I have to finding out more about things. An approach that I think comes in part from my background as, in technology and thinking about technology. As a side effect of investigating these issues, this inevitably results in a personal politics. It's sort of unavoidable. Whatever you might think of the UK immigration laws, I found myself as a result of this work sitting in a car park outside Stansted Airport on a kind of wet Tuesday night, watching people of colour being loaded off buses by armed police in the middle of the night. whatever it is you think of this system, when you see it face to face, it inevitably challenges those views. And the sudden transition from the kind of glossy screens of technology to the very real circumstances in which these technologies are enacted should perhaps shock you out of the idea that this stuff is invisible if you truly want to see it. As we go along, we're already getting better at building kind of more obvious pointed tools as well. Are there such things as Wikipedia histories of lawmaking? It sort of turns out there are. Actually, the legislation.gov.uk website turns out to be a kind of invaluable resource for tracking political intent, if you approach it with exactly this idea in mind. This is effectively a changelog, just like Wikipedia, but this is a record of law. What this is it shows over a number of years the subtle shifts of wording in UK immigration law that have turned a document that was originally produced to protect your rights as a British citizen into a document that's pretty much explicitly engineered to give the Home Secretary the ability to remove those rights. It's the same piece of legislation that's been edited through a series of right-wing pull requests over the last 10 years to produce a very different outcome. I'm not saying that governmental systems of legislation are or really should be like version control. But what I am saying is that those of us who understand how version control works can bring the understanding of those form of systems to an analysis of these kind of issues. Not least because at some level, those understandings increasingly shape and produce those politics as well. I just want to give a couple of examples of things that are interesting me and things that I want to do things that are more like, essentially. The Rolling Jubilee, if people don't know about this, is a hack, essentially, that's erased $15 million of personal debt in the USA by buying up people's junk debt. Because, of course, banks trade people's very real debt for pennies all of the time. So Rolling Jubilee, an offshoot of Occupy Wall Street, solicited donations in order to purchase that debt cheap and to set it free. They released those people of their debt. They forgave it, which is both a beautiful gesture that has a very, very real effect on those people's lives, while simultaneously pointing out to the rest of us that debt is just another construct, a product and an unequal and inequality-generating product of the way we currently do business. Or perhaps we could build actual things as well, like Caleb Larson's A Tool to Deceive and Slaughter, one of my favorite artworks, which is a black box sculpture, which when purchased and plugged into the wall, immediately starts trying to sell itself on eBay. And this is an artwork that comes with an end-user license agreement that requires the purchaser to not only plug it in, but to transfer it to its new owner when it's bought. This is an artwork that manipulates the very material conditions of its own context, and it redefines the art world power flows that kind of move around it. Objects are still useful for this, I think, and I want to use them, because they can be imbued with something resembling their own agency. They can go out and perform these actions in the world to themselves. What, for example, would be the shape of an object injected into the global trade system, or the offshore banking system, or the arms trade, not only to trace those flows, but to shape and redirect them. Despite what I said at the start of the lecture, I didn't even say it, actually, I skipped that bit. I was going to say, I'm all for kind of speculative utopias, but I'm not. I want actual things. I want techniques and processes which, by their action and their occupation of the actual space of this debate, disrupt the flows of power that are around us everywhere. This kind of legislative forensics that I'm engaging in here serves to remind us that behind all these systems lies a politics, an intent, and in one which we can intercede in. The brilliance of doing this in the mode of technology in particular is that while technology sometimes renders that intent obscure, it has ultimately to reveal it, because it's made of the same stuff as everything else. Paul Graham-Raven, in his very eloquent defense of utopias yesterday, urged us to think about the box. I want to think about the box, and then I want to think about who made the box and how they made it. And I want to fill it up with all of our real desires and imaginations until we find all the cracks in it, break it, and remake it better once again. Thank you very much.
helpful stuff. The permission we already have is a phrase that I kind of want to set aside and come back to as we kind of come to the end discussion. So thank you, James. Next up is Eleanor Saida. Many of you know or are familiar with Ella as you are with James. Ella is a hacker, designer, artist, technologist, force. She works to increase understanding of how complex systems work in our world, how they operate, how we can redesign them to work, and maybe even fail, and perhaps fail for the better. Her work is, as I've just described, crossing a number of disciplines, from electronics to software to social rules, which I think is a really important issue here. And she works with media to help kind of bring some level of legibility to this. She focuses on a seamless integration of technology into the lived experience. So if you'd please give a round of applause to Ella Saida.
Just a second here, sorry. So I've been spending a bunch of time thinking about surveillance these days. A lot more time thinking about surveillance than I'd really particularly like. It has, since our current revelations, it has ended up eating a lot of my life. It was already a somewhat time-consuming concern. No? Great. So I want to talk a little bit about what surveillance is and what it means and why we do it. Because we all do surveillance, and we all want surveillance to happen. We want states to take surveillance and to perform surveillance on our behalf if we want those states to exist at all, right? Surveillance is looking at the world. It is a function of being an entity that makes decisions and makes choices. We don't surveil because we're bored. We surveil because we want to see the world around us and to act on that world and to change it. When we change that world, we can make any number of different changes. They're not necessarily changes that all of us like, but if we don't see, we can't act. Surveillance happens at a lot of different scales. This is one of the things so I spend a lot of time working with high-risk users of the internet. And to me, a high-risk user is anyone who someone with power doesn't like. We find that we can become high-risk users extremely quickly. You step out into the street one day and all of a sudden you're someone else. You are performing a different role. But that surveillance, even in that context, ends up cutting both ways. This is another form of very personalized high-risk surveillance for high-risk users. The structure that world builds changes your everyday life. It changes the things that you get to do in the morning. You walk into a cafe and all of a sudden you have to think, do I pay with a credit card? Well, do I need anyone to not know that I'm here? Do I need someone to know that I'm here because I'm going to be leaving very quickly and I want them to think that I'm still here because I'm going to leave my phone behind? We come up with all of these micro-tactics that shape and change the way we live. And the pressure of technology, the pressure of the tools that get deployed around us and against us change all of those life patterns. Increasingly, surveillance isn't just a question of high-risk users, isn't just a question, even intelligence-level surveillance comes down to the very personal level, to the very everyday human level. There are 7 countries in the world where every single time you pick up the telephone, somebody at NRO records the call. Every single phone call. This changes what communication means. You want to call your girlfriend and tell her I love you. Someone is listening to that call. Some algorithm is listening to that call. Now, one of the things which is really interesting is you can think about surveillance on this kind of micro scale, but you can't actually change surveillance on this micro scale. One of the big lessons of looking at the recent history of surveillance, the post-war history of surveillance, basically, is that it is impossible to regulate surveillance as an economic or as a political function. The rule of law has no effect on intelligence surveillance, and it has had no effect on intelligence surveillance through its entire history. From the structure, the formation of the Westphalian state forward, that state that requires surveillance as a core function, as a core of its ability to see the world. Intelligence surveillance is always about what power can do. Because while states can agree, for instance, to treaties, they can agree that maybe, well, we don't want to fight, we don't want to, we want to agree to limited war, we want to agree to a peace treaty, we want to agree to this, to that. It's very hard to ask an entity not to see, when seeing is a thing that it's simply an autonomic process. One can choose whether or not one takes some specific action, but sight, you open your eyes in the morning and you're seeing. A state opens its eyes in the morning and it's surveilling. So what does control surveillance is economics and power. And this is a really interesting domain for someone who looks at system design, because it turns out that the reason why states do as much surveillance as they did is all of this stuff made it cheap. This is a bunch of Moroccan migrants trying to get cell signal from Spain so they can get onto a different network and cross a border. The fact that we built the internet the way it did, the fact that we built CCDs the way we have, the fact that MEMS gyros, the chips that can sense the orientation of your phone, now cost pennies, mean that thing, that surveillance drone, is now affordable, is now doable, is now cheap to build. It's also the thing that makes the congestion zone a thinkable structure. That this is based off the same AP&R systems that James was talking about. This is a function of surveillance that we may actually want. This has positive social impacts. And what we'd like as we think about shaping the structures, the economic and the power structures of intelligence surveillance, is we'd like to be able to shift the kinds of surveillance that happen so that, some surveillance maybe does still happen, but the kind of surveillance that we find socially harmful doesn't happen. So the way the state decides to surveil is it looks at an economic structure. It looks at the surveillance systems that they can build. It does engineering research to increase the set of surveillance capabilities that are accessible to it on the basis of the deployed technological infrastructure. Surveillance and mass surveillance specifically is always an infrastructural question. Now, getting rid of the infrastructure is obviously not an option. I, in a lot of contexts, describe myself as a road fetishist. I really like states to build roads because I like using roads. We can't just say, well, let's just get rid of all the infrastructure. But what we can do is we can shape that infrastructure. Now, most of that infrastructure, even the research systems that surveillance organizations use, this is a DARPA research smart bullet that can steer itself in flight. But this launch platform for an NRO satellite, that's a commercial launch platform. It's built by a company. The internet is built by Google, is built by Level 3, is built by AT&T, is built by this long list of corporations. They make technological choices. They make technological choices on the basis of culture, on the basis of market conditions, on the basis of, in some ways, just like keeping their employees happy. There was a big to-do inside Google when a lot of the SSL, the secure web snooping that NSA was doing came out, because a lot of the engineers were furious. And it didn't matter whether or not management was like, well, whatever, this is a PR issue for us a little bit. The engineers were pissed. They were not going to stand for this. They had built an internet, and they had put some politics into that internet. I got to talk to some of the old kind of Unix gray hairs late last year at a conference, and got to listen to them talking about the politics that they built into that internet and where those politics have gone now. And to a certain extent, for the parts of the internet that they managed to kind of keep under control, those politics still mean the same thing that they did when they built that internet. But they've been subverted at different layers, and those guys are pissed. Those guys are furious. They're going to tear the world apart and rebuild it in a new image. And at some level, Google has to fight surveillance, not purely for market reasons, but because if they don't, all of their engineers are going to quit because they don't want to work for a thing that enables that. It is difficult to get people to be that guy. That is a cost in nationalism, in rhetoric, in cultural shaping, in structure, to have someone remain complicit with the state when you can see the brutality that you're inflicting on the world around you. So, as interventionists, we get to look at designing logistical change within a hostile frame, within a frame that doesn't necessarily want us to design that change. The way that we can make those changes starts with looking at the market conditions, starts with looking at all of the boring regulation that, network neutrality, right? So network neutrality is something that a lot of technologists care very deeply about. It's basically whether an ISP can decide what kind of traffic flows over their pipes and charge some companies more to send you, whether Comcast, a big residential ISP in the US, can charge Netflix extra money on top of what the customers have already paid them for their service to be able to see Netflix's movies, right? So there's a big regulatory fight about this. This is room 641A inside AT&T, which is where we found out in the mid-2000s that the NSA was doing some wiretapping. Net neutrality seems like a completely unrelated fight to the surveillance world, but it turns out that there are three big properties that we need of systems that can resist centralized surveillance, regardless of the actor. We need decentralization, we need end-to-end encryption, and we need verifiability. And decentralization basically means that you don't have a single point of control. You don't have a single structure that one of these entities can kind of get their claws into, where all of the information passes through that, or where they can say, well, you're using end-to-end encryption, which means that, from the phone in my pocket to the phone in your pocket, there's a direct connection that's encrypted all the way, not in single discrete hops like we have now, even on SSL on the web. A lot of the time that's just single hops, and the intermediaries can get their claws in there. It's direct from my pocket to your pocket. And the keys are controlled appropriately so that no one can get around the edges of that. But if you have end-to-end encryption without decentralization, your central authorities can just say, well, we don't like that, we're going to turn it off. So, and then verifiability is the other property, because as we've seen again and again, if you have closed systems, if you have systems which are opaque to their users, and in this case I mean opaque in very specific technical senses, but this is true in general, even talking about social systems. The opacity of the deportation systems that James was talking about enables a lot of the abuses. If the UK border force had to work completely in the open, it would be a lot harder for them to do a lot of the things that they do. It would be a lot harder for them to say, well, you're not turned on by this specific piece of porn, so therefore you must not be gay, so we're going to send you back to Uganda. It's a lot harder if you have to do that in front of the public instead of just in a closed room somewhere. So, again, the subversion of technology, this is a Stasi audio bug from a very, very long time ago. They've gotten much smaller and much better and much more ephemeralized, because that's the thing that technology does. we can use these different policy levers in entirely different places to play a very long game. This is one of the, I was listening to some of my technologist friends talking about the scope on which this is going to be fixed, and a friend said that this is going to be all decided in the next 18 months. This is the scale. This history is the scale that we're fighting about. Any civilization that has surveillance or that has electronic communication systems is going to deal with electronic surveillance and is going to deal with the social effects of electronic surveillance, of who gets watched in what contexts. And so we don't, in some ways that's great for us. I mean, it means that we're going to fight this fight forever, but it also means that we don't have a hurry. We don't have to rush. There are path dependencies, there are lock-ins, there are times when it may be more efficient to act, but we don't have to worry about winning this immediately. And I think that the lessons of that 40-year scope of the construction of the internet, that the time over which that kind of deep infrastructural time has happened, give us cause to believe that we can actually make these changes in a reasonable way. A lot of what matters here, so there's specific short-term structural fights, the structural politics that'll determine the specific infrastructures. But a lot of what we're actually looking about, a lot of what matter in the long term, is kind of our dreams and our cultural hopes and our cultural understandings. This is the literacy work that James is talking about, the way we see these systems and the way we see cultural impact over deep time. If we don't try to keep that understanding present, to keep that understanding in our heads, it's going to get away from us. Systems that ephemeralize, that get smaller and smaller. Right now we're in this really interesting moment where you can see a lot of this hardware still, where it still is sort of readable. And, as it increasingly goes from giant data centers, which are legible on the horizon, to something that's just sitting inside of a device that all of us are already carrying around. And to a certain extent, it's already in there. But as that transition happens, it's going to get harder and harder to keep that cultural awareness. So I think we're in a moment where we're in a unique position of being able to shape our understanding of what surveillance means. It's not some creepy guy sitting up in orbit taking photographs of us. That's actually a NASA shot. I'm sure he's a lovely person. But, and it's not this kind of like Stasi-era technology. It's already getting smaller and smaller and smaller. But, we can still keep it in mind, even as it gets baked into the cultural scripts, as first in the periphery of empire, increasingly it comes closer and closer to home. This is the function of empire, at first at the border, at the checkpoint, at the, you come into the UK as a foreigner and you have no rights, everything can be searched, it's all open, and then sooner and sooner it's closer and closer to home. The KGB listening stations vanish into just some code that's running on a system somewhere. And, who knows really who's actually the beneficiary of that code. This is one of the things that really complicates the notion of using international law to control surveillance is, we might be able to legislate GCHQ. I mean, I don't think it's plausible, but, we could pretend. We might be able to legislate CIA. We're not going to be able to legislate FSB. We're not going to be able to legislate Mossad's Unit 49. And if this stuff leaks too far into the culture, it's going to be very, very hard to root out. We're already accustomed to seeing it every day, and we ignore it so often. We need to stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Ella. That was, I think, the sort of mention of culture and timescales, particularly kind of being in this setting. It's a conference where we're talking on the one hand about things that are very kind of fast, very ephemeral. But on the other hand, we're talking about kind of deep-level culture. So the next person I want to talk about is, and have up on stage is Adam Harvey. Adam's a designer, an artist whose methods look at, kind of from a different perspective than our first two speakers, look at maintaining personal privacy, and protection from surveillance, but from the kind of individual's point of view, looking back at the systems, using novel design solutions to oppose technology such as drones, genetic surveillance. His work places these existing technologies, such as dazzle paint, thermal protective layers, into a modern context. Some of you who were here prior to the conference kicking off on Monday may have had an opportunity to visit with Adam in the City Fictions installation over in Noma, where he was actually applying some of the CV Dazzle makeup that he'd be talking about, I'm sure, both on Ella looked fantastic, and even on a baby. So that's one for the future. So Adam, I'd like you to come up on stage and tell us.
Thank you. It's really great to be here in Manchester. I've been here since Thursday. And as Scott said, I did the Anon Salon over the weekend. This was the world's first privacy makeover, kind of anonymity salon. So it was a real experiment, and I think it worked pretty well. So if this is going, what do I need to... Let's see, start here. And this is an example of a CV Dazzle pattern. This one was developed last. So, while that's going on, I guess I'll introduce my talk a little bit. That it's a little bit of new material that I want to introduce, this idea that surveillance is something that primarily exists within the electromagnetic spectrum, which is something that's largely dark to us because our eyes as sensors are only sensitive to a certain frequency within this very wide spectrum. It's interesting to think about this spectrum and how it relates to surveillance because anything that's electromagnetic energy can be picked up by different kinds of sensors. It's a wide range. Visible is what we all know, and we're also familiar with recording in this spectrum. We assume that it's the truth, but now I'm going to start this and I'll come back and pick up on some thoughts about surveillance in the electromagnetic spectrum. So to roll back to what I was talking about with the CV Dazzle project and the project that happened within City Fictions over the weekend on Saturday and Sunday, we did about between 10 and 12 makeovers, and as Scott mentioned, we did the world's first baby CV Dazzle makeover, and I have a picture of that for you here. It's pretty great. Another example that came out of the Anon Salon is this look here. This is the before look where you can see faces being detected on a frontal perspective and also at a profile, using open technology called OpenCV or Open Computer Vision. The name of this project, CV Dazzle, has nothing to do with resumes, but has to do with computer vision and a type of camouflage that was used during World War I called dazzle. Dazzle is a kind of camouflage that works in an interesting way because it deceives the viewer. Not that something is existing, but what its intention is, whether it's moving to the left or to the right, whether it's one or two things. And that's the idea with this project, is that you exist to other humans, and we know that you're also a human, but to a machine, they don't understand that your face is a face. So you get to exist in two different states, in two different perceptions, human and computer. The counter-surveillance, I had a great discussion with Liam Young over the weekend, and we were discussing counter-surveillance in regards to how it relates to fashion, technology, and art. And there's this interesting parallel between counter-surveillance and fashion in that both of them are trying to stay one step ahead of the other person or one season ahead of the latest algorithms. And in that regard, counter-surveillance is something that relies heavily on research and in reading about the latest discoveries, proposals, and news in the defense industry. So my typical daily reading is like Vogue and Department of Defense proposals and DARPA press releases. And somewhere in between is, okay, so I don't know if I have audio, do I? Yeah. No, it's going to be not a great video then. Didn't plan for this. I'll kind of narrate over her voice. 60 Minutes is a very widely watched program in the United States. It's totally mainstream, and it presents topics that impact the whole country. This episode was about national security in regards to the failure of biometric technology to recognize a suspect from the Boston bombing. In this episode, they discuss how ubiquitous face recognition technology is becoming. I'll make the distinction here that face detection technology is the first step for a face recognition system, and that the project CV Dazzle works by blocking the face from being detected, so preventing face detection. Now here's an expert who runs a biometrics company, Joseph Attic. He also works with the FBI to help identify and profile suspects. In this video for 60 Minutes, now he's talking about the issue that even he realizes with face detection in the public domain is that everyone's face is now becoming a sort of fingerprint, and you're walking around almost with your social security number on your face. And now he says there's this artist who does this project, and luckily he seems to like it because given that he does work for the FBI, I was a little concerned. And the narrator ends by saying, one day we may all wear a veil. The burqa may come here, which is a lead-in to my next project. Oh. Maybe it'll play the second one. Some of the work that went into the CV Dazzle project is becoming a computer vision practitioner and understanding how the algorithms work. Each project that I take on within counter-surveillance is kind of a slight job change, changing my profession a little bit to understand the technology and the science behind these surveillance technologies. On the right is a video of extruding the importance of different points on the face and how they're analyzed by a face detection algorithm. You can see around the nose there's a peak of interest. Let me go back and see if this video will play. Okay, so then now the video here is showing a rectangle moving across an image, scanning it and analyzing the weights of different areas of the image. It'll keep going across the image, the rectangle will grow, and if enough possible matches overlap, then it'll qualify that area as a face. The algorithm has no idea what is a face and what isn't. It's all based on a probability. And if you can understand the probability of a surveillance algorithm, of course face detection is used for a lot of different purposes, but if you can understand that threshold, then you can move towards finding out how to be one step below it. And essentially that's camouflage, algorithmically defined. Now, this video includes a special cameo by James. I just met James when I started working on another counter-surveillance project, which is called Stealthware. And this project looks at thermal imaging, which if you put in perspective with kind of a fashion trend report, thermal imaging is something that's now making its way into mainstream imaging devices. This year, probably within the next month, a company called FLIR will release an attachment for your iPhone, meaning that anybody here has access now to a technology that used to cost maybe $20,000 for a 640 by 480 image. You can get that now for maybe $5,000, 320 by 240. These are just some examples of putting heat onto a fabric and seeing how it retains that heat. You can kind of see how unflattering thermal is. But it's a new way of seeing a person, and it's what makes you, that you're also thermal. Thermal energy is part of the electromagnetic spectrum as well. Now, if we look, here's the project which turned into a collection of fashion items, including a hoodie, a burqa, and a hijab. So you can see the difference between the thermal radiation that's emitted by the model's body with the hoodie and without the hoodie in her midriff area. And here's an example of the burqa. This project garnered quite a bit of attention, and with some of these counter-surveillance projects, I'm not sure what's going to happen when I release them. They're existing in this kind of gray area where they're possibly interesting enough to other engineers working in security that it doesn't quite seem to be illegal, or maybe people don't know how to deal with art, and maybe that's an advantage of working with counter-surveillance art. Now, I want to kind of present this sort of new idea about thinking through surveillance as a part made up of the electromagnetic spectrum. But I want to preface it with a new way of describing myself, which is that I exist here instantly in the visible light spectrum, but I also exist right now at 2.4 gigahertz because my phone is on. And I also exist at 800 megahertz because my phone is connected to a cellular network. When I exist at 2.4 and 800 megahertz, my existence is delayed by several hundred milliseconds. I'm a simulation of myself through electromagnetic medium. But I know what I look like here in the visible light spectrum because I know I can use a mirror and I understand exactly what I look like right now. But I don't know how other people see me at 2.4 gigahertz. I don't know how they're looking at me at 800 megahertz. I also know that I exist thermally because I'm emitting infrared energy. And I know what I look like because I've used a thermal camera enough to understand what parts of me are warm and which ones are cool. But I also know that I exist as a sound wave that's reaching people in the back room as well as the front of the room. And I know that people in the front of the room experience what I'm saying and how I'm looking before people in the back of the room. This is all physics that we understand. The bulk of my existence, as it can be surveilled, exists within the electromagnetic spectrum. If you think about surveillance as something, as a problem that can be analyzed, studied, and possible workarounds within this spectrum, then I think it's easier to introduce counter-surveillance solutions or workarounds. So I have this kind of, mini manifesto of how I'm thinking about surveillance right now. It's good to lead off of your talk, Ella. I'm thinking now about surveillance as a simulation of an exact point in the space-time continuum marked by not milliseconds, but picoseconds. And that, as I said, most surveillance that's happening to us through our phones, through the computer, is mediated, and it's happening through some type of electromagnetic medium, through the spectrum. That observation through a medium can only be a simulation, and it can never be the exact thing. There is no such thing as an exact mirror to reflect, to kind of teleport me to a different area. And we know that we can interfere with observation by modifying our simulation. This is completely obvious when you stand in front of the mirror and you prepare for your day. You know where you're going, and you know how to dress for that occasion. And I think while that's totally obvious, we don't know the environment that we exist in for surveillance and how people are looking at us. And that if we did, then we could understand and we could adapt the ways that we talk to each other, using possibly encryption for certain conversations, or being wide open when we want somebody to hear what we're saying. We can wear clothes that cloak our thermal radiation or that block 2.4 gigahertz with metal-plated fabrics. We exist in many different environments at the same time, possibly with small delays. And we exist in these moments in many different points in history. I exist in the future to someone else for the first time that you're standing in front of now. It sounds maybe futuristic, but we've been doing that for a while. So how do we adapt the way that we live in a surveillance environment with so many versions of ourselves out there, so many variations, representations of ourselves, our virtual self, our existence at 1 terahertz? So then I'll end with a few speculative questions. How do we behave at 1 terahertz? Terahertz is a frequency that's used for a police scanning technology to be able to see what is inside your pocket. Items have unique kind of spectral responses at 1 terahertz, and you can see from a distance if somebody's carrying a gun or a pack of gum. And how do we behave at frequencies that we already know a little bit, 800 megahertz, 2.4 gigahertz, and 5 gigahertz? So I'd like to end with those questions. Yeah.
Thanks, Adam. So now we've got about, I think, probably 15 minutes for questions. So I'll get some hand signals that will really give me the idea. Do you need some water? Yeah, all right. And first, I will provide refreshments for my guests. I think my first question actually goes to James and Ella. Well, actually, across all three. I mean, James, you've worked on both things like the Ring of Steel that we talked about, and also, have had time to look at different surveillance cultures in the U.S. Ella, clearly you've worked in many places in the world and sort of seen these differences. And Adam, even your work kind of demonstrates not just a kind of, American developed country Western position on this, but you've looked at this kind of idea of the burqa, the hijab, sort of different kind of clothing forms. I'm curious as to how you sort of see. We know that governments are increasingly becoming kind of fairly similar in their kind of bureaucratic approach, but the cultures, the individual citizen culture seems quite different. And how are our responses kind of differing across these cultures to these technologies, to these systems?
I guess what I've seen, in a lot of ways, getting outside of the American bubble was what really pushed me to start working on surveillance more seriously, because it was, seeing people who had a lot more at stake, and had a lot more at stake in the context of specific interactions with governments whose surveillance wasn't quite omnipotent, omnipresent, but where there was room for some negotiation, where there was room for some struggle, without needing to become perfect in every moment. Yeah, there's a wide range of responses, and I think there's a wide range of understanding of political agency, and that those two are not. It's not accidental that those come together. it's shocking for me when I come into the UK how little discussion there is around surveillance here in some ways. I think to a certain degree that's a population and a community that's been shown for a very long time that they don't have any choice, that they have no feedback, have no way of controlling it. I don't think that that's actually true. I think that there's a cultural narrative that's been created there. I look forward to seeing that narrative break.
James, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I too am constantly baffled by the kind of British attitude to this stuff as being like the most, as a nation whose sort of most cliched counterparts are kind of like, though it pales in comparison in truth to the real American kind of individualism, this idea that we are somehow kind of, little islands, and yet we're quite happy to be wonderfully observed by the delightful state at all times. Patrick Keeler always said that the problem with the British is that we've never been able to sustain a proper revolution, which I think probably sharpens your attitude to these things somewhat. And also, we've never lived under a regime that has properly affected the majority of us in any serious way. If you go and look at the laws in Germany, you see very stark contrast. My favourite of which is the law in Germany, which is informally known as the Pixelrectung, i.e. the right to be pixelated. Which seriously affects the use of, for example, Google Street View in that country. And in which case, a surveillance technology, which Street View is on multiple levels, also becomes one of these things that starts to illuminate those differences as well, and it starts to kind of force out the shape. And by doing it, we start to see some of the gaps in our own attitudes to these things that we haven't talked too much, thankfully, about Google Glass, but Google Glass is the kind of charismatic megafauna of the surveillance debate, because it gives us something we can talk about. And when you watch people's kind of very powerful reactions to that, and then they start to think, well, if I'm not okay with this individual who I may even know socially surveilling me at all time, how do I feel about these strangers? So there's huge differences, but also perhaps as there's newer ways of talking about them emerging.
Adam, has that come into your work at all at this point? You're using a kind of culturally relevant form in the kind of burqa, but does it go deeper than that?
Well, I think the idea with the burqa was to get two cultures to try to understand each other a little bit more. And I think the type of surveillance that's manufactured in the U.S. and I guess Israel too, because they're very linked, that's exported, and that becomes a cultural export in a way. With Street View, you accept that that's part of culture. Taking photos, 360 view of every part of the urban area. And it's nice to see, especially in Germany, people stand up against that. It's a very aggressive way of kind of laying claim to something that's public. The city is a public space, and when somebody lays claim to photographic imagery of that area, uses it for profit. It's good to see people rejecting that. Would hope to see a little bit more, or the idea that at least a foreign country can't come and lay claim to it, but that's the sovereign property of the local area.
I want to kind of stay with this culture idea for a minute because we too tend to kind of slip back towards a discussion of technology. If you say the word systems, people nowadays think technological systems, they think infrastructure systems, but it's, you can't just interdict physical systems like that and solve the issue or even come close to a solution. You've got to, not just wires, servers, cameras, but as James, you pointed out, Ella as well, it's policy, it's workflow, it's human practices, it's states of mind, it's expectations and culturals. And even in this last kind of slide dump, that were one of the last slide dumps we've seen, they come so often, the idea of kind of behavioral modification and social disruption being some of the tools, that's kind of getting in our own heads. It's getting deep in our heads. How do we get beyond that? Like, what are the first steps we can take or additional steps we can take to kind of address at a deep cultural level?
I think continuing to have these conversations, continuing to produce kind of oppositional cultural works that don't let us forget about it, you know. But I guess deeper than that, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is dreams and how we understand our own utopias, how we understand our futures. The 20th century is kind of the century of the just ever-shrinking sphere of the imaginable, you know, the death of the political imagination, the death of the imagination of how we can live, you know, capitalist, neoliberal realism, there is no alternative, you know, repeated again and again and again in different spheres. And I think that there's something incredibly powerful about just looking at the world that we live in and saying, well, what do we want to live in, you know? Because the thing is, in the end, you know, the power centralizers, the pre-network centralizers, they're going to lose. You know, the internet is going to win. Well, they're going to lose. The question is whether the internet wins, right? And if we want to win that cultural fight, we need to have some idea of where we want to live, and we need to have some kind of dream that we want to build.
Thoughts? I mean, it's, you know, getting down to the level of like having play school toys that represent the security state. I mean, that's kind of gotten down to quite a deep level, and probably not a very welcome level, or surely not a very welcome level. Do we have any kind of questions from the audience? It's your experience. I think we've got a hand in the back. Is there a microphone that's close by?
By the way, I think I actually have seen spy camera toys for kids for sale on Amazon.
Yes, you've got a question?
Yes, I'm Eva Pasco from Cyber Salon. We've run a series of surveillance events in London for the last 6 months, and the conclusion was that people really want to change the law before they get involved in cryptography or independent business models or balkanization of the internet. But to fix the future, you kind of need to start now. And I wonder how many people in this room actually bothered to send a letter to their MP to object to surveillance. Hands up.
Anyone?
Right. There is a template on cybersalon.org website. You're very welcome to use it, and please send it, because every time we talk to MPs, and we talk to them a lot, they say, nobody cares, I have no letters.
I mean, I think that's great and all, but the big lesson of history is that law can't constrain surveillance. So, yes, we need to make sure that people are aware, including politicians, of it as a cultural issue, but the legal structures aren't going to be the thing that certainly intelligence surveillance is not going to be reined in by law. That's going to require infrastructural and social and economic change, sadly. It would be very nice if law would do it, because then we could all, you know, just let the lawyers do the work.
James, this is a kind of, you know, topic that came up yesterday on the Superfictions panel. I think you might have used the phrase, those of us who understand. And, you know, we are, while we're very different people on stage, we're still kind of representative of a larger but singular group within the overall kind of world sphere. You know, it's about economics and power in a sense, and yes, while we may have the opportunity right now to sort of use economics and power, as Ella described, how do we kind of take it beyond that and not simply have it, you know, stay captured within a small kind of socioeconomic group?
I think one of the things that I've seen is that it's not that surveillance is captured within a small economic group, and it's not even that the understanding of surveillance is captured within a small socioeconomic group. It's that the understanding of this specific kind of surveillance is captured within a small socioeconomic group. At least in New York or in the U.S., if we talk about stop and frisk, that is a form of surveillance. It's an aggressive form of surveillance that you know, hundreds of thousands, millions of people are desperately and intimately familiar with. And if we don't draw the parallels between all of this, you know, international surveillance, Snowden wankery, and the lived experience of people who actually have to deal with a much, much harsher surveillance regime than any of us are ever going to see, then yeah, of course it's going to remain isolated.
Yeah, I mean, it's what we're all attempting to provide a roadmap for. You can address this thing by achieving kind of correct change at the infrastructural level. You can also do it to some extent by translating it into different languages that give people the new ways to think about it. Whether that's through kind of product design, engaging with it on a commercial level, whether it's kind of in art galleries or through other forms of artwork. My thing is always, and this extends far beyond surveillance, which to some extent I treat as, on one level as well as just another metaphor for talking about kind of complex network systems, is that all our metaphors are broken. Like, we have so few good ways of talking about this and conceptualizing this stuff that we're just way behind on it, right? I agree that the internet or some future form of it will win, but it will largely win because we spread a better understanding of its actual function, so that the argument that there is no alternative simply doesn't stand up anymore.
Do we have any more questions from the floor before we close? Any hands? I think we're going to go ahead and leave it there at that point. I think I'd like to thank the three folks who are up here on stage for fantastic kind of illumination of the issues that we face and shedding a little bit of light through their ongoing work and future work on these kind of complex systems. And thank you all for your questions and interest. Thanks very much.